Hello everyone, this is Strawberry Podfic. We are reading It's a Small World by emphasis on Ghostwriter, Chapter 3, Izuku's Dilemma. Izuku was so tired by the time he got to the, honestly kinda sketchy, apartment he called home that he just dropped his gear where he took it off at and face-planted on top of his bed. He usually took better care of his gear, but sue him, he had a long day. He groaned and curled onto his side, grabbing his pillow to cuddle it to his chest as he went, brain still far too active post-patrol to even think about actually falling asleep. The part that kept circulating around in his thoughts wasn't even everything that had happened with All Might, although he'd probably have the freak-out learning national secrets deserved the next day. It's probably fine. He was long since used to heroes being quirkist, and it's not like the man knew who he actually was, thanks to the hat he wore helping obfuscate his ears, making it harder to track him down. So he was stuck on that last conversation with Aizawa. It wasn't the first time they'd had it, and he had no doubt it wouldn't be the last. He had trusted the two men, even if he had only met Yamada the 2 or 3 times Aizawa had been supposed to meet Izuku or give him something, and gotten called away, so the blonde had to come in his stead. Anyone Aizawa trusted like that, Izuku knew he could too. He also knew, at least objectively, that they legitimately cared about him, actually wanted him to be part of their family, even if he couldn't actually understand it after everything. The worst part was that he wanted that too. He didn't know when everything had gotten so fucked up. There was the obvious, fateful day he got his diagnosis, always going to be bullshit that's a diagnosis. Hisashi, his sperm donor, had never been happy about the latent cat mutation features Izuku had inherited from Inko's parental line. Apparently, some great-great-grandparent had a cat quirk, and traits tended to pop up every few generations. Inko had even shared the claws instead of fingernails Izuku had, though Izuku also had green-furred cat ears, the ability to purr, growl, and hiss, and longer/sharper canines. Luckily, for the sake of his vigilante career, he didn't have a tail that he had to worry about. Claws instead of nails was fairly common, and he was careful to avoid swiping in his fighting style. The fangs and ears were easy to cover with his original hat and mask combo, and his current trusty helmet once he'd learned the hat and mask weren't quite enough. The fangs and ears were easy to cover with his original hat and mask combo, and his current trusty helmet once he'd learned that the hat and mask weren't quite enough. The voice modulator he'd made also filtered out the more feline sounds he emitted. It would have been tolerable, though, if Izuku had actually developed a quirk. Even more so if it had been a version of Hisashi's fire-breathing quirk. He packed up and left the very night they found out he most likely never would. Shortly after that, the hospital where Inko had been working for years found out and fired her. She eventually found another job working the night shift at a far less reputable ER. But that was essentially when Inko mentally checked out of any relationship she'd had with her son. Izuku had always had food, clothes, anything he needed for school, but she oddly enough kept buying him All Might merchandise from time to time. Maybe to make herself feel like she was still a somewhat decent mother, Izuku wasn't sure. But he basically raised himself after that. She didn't notice when the bullying at school got worse either. He'd started seeing her less and less around the age of 8, money sometimes accompanied by short notes being left on the counter for him, so he stopped spending so much time at their apartment when he wasn't in school. A lot of it was spent at the local library, where the librarians thought him adorable and were more than happy to help him find resources or information on whatever latest thing had struck his fancy. Izuku soaked up information like a sponge, and they basically taught him nothing at school anyways. Their coding classes geared towards preteens, they let him join even though he was younger, were initially what got him into coding, and then he taught himself more on his own. He even started a quirk science and analysis blog that started to pick up traction. He was just ecstatic to finally have a place where his rambling wasn't seen as so creepy. It's also where he was introduced to the underground and online quirkless community. He'd already been aware of online spaces for people with quirks that were often discriminated against, usually so-called villainous and mutation quirks, but he'd never realized the quirkless community was so established until another quirkless patron figured out he didn't know and pulled him aside one evening to show him where and how to find it. Honestly, it was life-changing for him. Suddenly he had access to a community he hadn't known he'd needed and resources he'd later on need to rely on. It's also how he found the dojo. He found it when he was 9, and it was on the smaller side, about a 20-minute walk from his house, and it was one of the very few places that didn't care or ask about people's quirk status. Izuku started learning self-defense there first, hoping it could help with the ever-increasing bullying at school. It didn't. He was just punished more by the teachers, then later moved on to various forms of martial arts. He was 10 when he came home to a note from Inko telling him Hizashi had offered to fly her to America to start over with him, but that she'd paid off the rest of the lease and left him food in the fridge and more money than usual on the counter. He hadn't known how to feel about the fact. He was honestly more surprised and he hadn't known how to feel about the fact. He hadn't known how to feel about the fact. He was honestly more surprised she had even left the note instead of just leaving. By then, though, he'd had years to teach himself advanced coding and hacking, and knew far more about how the internet and world worked than a kid his age should. Once he got over the initial shock and panic, he got to work. He didn't bother going to school, though he was later able to set himself up in an online school. He knew at some point he'd need the documentation of actually finishing classes, and it's not like the classes were hard. He doubted they'd even care enough to call Inko anyways, and focused on selling as much hero merch and furniture as he could without drawing too much attention to himself so he could get as much money as possible, and made the appropriate bank accounts, etc., that he needed to keep it in, with some hacking, of course. They weren't just going to give a 10-year-old a bank account. He used those funds to buy himself a good, solid laptop and computer setup. If he was going to be hacking that much, he needed to have devices he could do it from safely. He also moved from simply running a quirk science and analysis blog to selling quirk analysis. It started slow, but by the time he was forced to find his own cheaper apartment in a sketchier neighborhood, it had to be at least somewhat sketchy to pull off being able to rent it as an unaccompanied 10-year-old. That, combined with working part-time under the table at the dojo, helping clean, organize, and set things up, he was mostly able to support himself. Ultimately, becoming Ghost had been one of the simpler processes of his life. He was walking back to his apartment from the dojo one day and stumbled across a girl not much older than him getting mugged. His feet had moved before he even knew what he was doing, and he was able to knock the mugger out before he even knew Izuku was there. After that, he started keeping an eye out for similar people in need, and that just sort of turned into being a vigilante, but only when he knew it was a situation he could actually handle and the cops and heroes wouldn't get there in time. Everything only snowballed after that fateful run-in with Eraserhead. It was stressful and more than a little terrifying, but he made it work. The only other option was the streets. He knew he'd never survive being sent to foster care. He also tried not to think too hard about some of the analysis he was selling. He knew there was a chance it was being used badly, but it's not like he had much of a choice. That wasn't the part that was coming back to bite him in the ass though. That part was the hacking. Izuku had been the now famous hacker I don't know how to say that. I'm going to do my best. Dartigan, for almost as long as he'd been Ghost. His escapades as Dartigan had started as a careful balancing act, as much as he tried not to think about what his analysis might be being used for. He couldn't ignore it when he saw villain attacks on the news clearly using his analysis. He'd thrown up the first time it had happened. The second time, he'd created Dartigan. Basically, he used the identity to keep tabs on who he was providing analysis to. He vetted every client at that point, and when he could afford it, he turned down those who were obviously villains. When he couldn't, he acted as Dartigan to bring them down before they could hurt anyone, after being paid, of course. That's where the balancing act came in, making sure his actions as Dartigan couldn't be traced back to his analysis business. Branching out his work as Dartigan helped finding other criminal organizations and corruption to bring to light. Literally, in some cases, going to the media instead of just going to the cops wouldn't work. They wouldn't listen, or when they were, the corrupted party in question is what led to Dartigan being as infamous as he was. The media had a field day every time he made waves, and no one wanted to be on his radar. He loved being Dartigan as much as he loved being Ghost, but he never forgot how Dartigan was born. He didn't know if his heroes would still care about him if they knew he'd, even accidentally, even if he had no choice, helped villains. Didn't know if they even could. It potentially even made him a villain too. He couldn't be arrested for vigilantism since he didn't have a quirk, but he probably could for aiding and abetting villainy. He hoped they would. They worked for Nezu, who was a far more accomplished hacker than Izuku could ever hope to be after all. But he didn't know for sure, and he couldn't bring himself to take that risk, especially since one of Aizawa's closest friends was Tsukachi, a detective with a lie detecting quirk. Izuku actually liked Tsukachi too. He and Aizawa often interacted with the man on patrols. It was always nerve-wracking because the wrong thing said in front of him had the potential to ruin everything. But he was a solid detective and a good man. Izuku wouldn't be opposed to seeing him as an uncle if things were different. He desperately wanted the dream that Aizawa had painted for him, though. He could hardly believe it at first that someone, an adult, much less a hero, was trying to win his trust, apparently without any ulterior motives. Like he hadn't actually believed it, the only reason Izuku had allowed Eraserhead to take him to Recovery Girl, they'd met at a neutral third location. Anywhere else would have been too hard for Izuku to get away from had they decided to hand him over to proper authorities, was because he was one of the few heroes who'd been approved as safe on the Quirkless forums. That, and he'd made it very clear he just wasn't going to leave until Izuku caved to seeking some form of medical treatment. After Izuku woke up from his impromptu nap post-kiss on the hand from Recovery Girl, the man had just given him a first aid kit from his utility belt and sent him on his way. Izuku hadn't been expecting that, nor had he expected the man to keep showing up. At first it was just the random run-ins, then he started giving Izuku supplies, which turned into short conversations, some of which made Izuku wonder if he was just repurposing first day of school icebreakers. He was a teacher after all. Around the point Izuku finally started accepting food from the man, usually cooked by his husband, Izuku ate homemade food cooked by Eraserhead's husband. He gave Izuku his name, his full name, Aizawa Shota, and a name to call his husband by, Zashi, with permission from said husband, so he wasn't just constantly referring to a husband out in public when he was in uniform, and anyone could potentially overhear them. Neither of them even minded that Izuku never gave his. Izuku hadn't expected to meet what was clearly civilian present Mike the first time Aizawa was supposed to bring him a meal and wouldn't be able to. He texted Izuku ahead of time that Zashi would be waiting at their spot just in case, but that Izuku didn't have to show up if he was uncomfortable. But he hadn't wanted to break his word to Ghost, even if Aizawa himself couldn't show up. So, yeah, Izuku had realized a while back that he trusted both of these men, that he saw Aizawa as a father figure, and the man likely saw him as a son. Izuku didn't miss Aizawa hiding his smile in his capture scarf every time he said it the first few months he'd started using it. He just didn't know what to do about it. Thoughts still going in circles, exhaustion eventually overcame him, and Izuku finally drifted off. In a few hours, when he woke up, he'd find himself facing an empty fridge in the kitchen, finally remembering the groceries that he'd lost the day before. In a few months, he'd find himself facing the events that would change everything. And that is, that's chapter 3 for this fic. This was my second take of this fic, because there was a word pretty early on, not of this fic, of this chapter, this is my second take, because there was a word pretty early on in the chapter, and I didn't know if it was a typo, or if it was a real word, or how to say it, and I was having trouble, so I had to stop and Google it. So, I still don't know how to say his hacker name, though. That is chapter 3. I will see you guys next time. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you guys later. Goodbye!